Today, I bring you a charming new mystery featuring none other than the brilliant Hercule Poirot, the world's most famous Belgian detective, created by Agatha Christie. This case is filled with twists, clever clues, and Poirot's signature little grey cells at work. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now let's get started. It was on one of those rare English summer days, warm but not oppressive, bright but not garish, that Hercule Poirot and I arrived at Marchmont Manor. I remember remarking upon the serenity of the landscape, the clipped hedges, the vast lawns, and the way the sun filtered through the oaks, casting long golden shadows across the gravel drive. My companion, of course, remained largely unimpressed. "Too many bees, Hastings," he muttered, swatting the air with his handkerchief. "And the grass, it is too green. A suspiciously healthy colour, if you ask me. Nature, she conceals her dangers under beauty, n'est-ce pas?" We were the guests of Colonel Archibald Marchmont, a man I had known during my time in India. Tall, grey-moustached, and every inch the traditional English officer. He had retired years ago to this stately country manor, and though we had corresponded occasionally, this was the first time I'd seen him in a decade. Marchmont greeted us at the entrance with a firm handshake and a booming voice. "Blast it, Hastings, it's good to see you again. And this must be the famous Monsieur Poirot. Heard much about you, none of it believable." Poirot smiled politely. "That, mon colonel, is often the case with legends." The manor had all the expected trappings: ancestral portraits, mahogany panelling, and the faint but unmistakable smell of old cigars and older secrets. Mrs. Danvers, the housekeeper, not, I assure you, the one from Rebecca, showed us to our rooms while Marchmont promised brandy and cigars on the terrace. It was a peaceful setting. Too peaceful, perhaps. As Poirot once told me, "The most dangerous stories, mon ami, begin with the illusion of tranquility." And as I unpacked my suitcase, I had no reason to suspect that within a few days, this house would play host to blackmail, buried secrets, and a murder that had waited 10 years for justice. Dinner was served in the long candle-lit dining room, white linen, polished silver, and the kind of roast beef that can only be achieved by a cook who has spent 40 years perfecting it. The table was modestly set for 6. Colonel Marchmont at the head, Helen Marchmont, his daughter-in-law, Dr. Whitcomb, the local physician, Miss Lane, the companion, Poirot, and myself. The conversation was pleasant, if uneventful. Helen spoke of local charity events with a certain dryness. Miss Lane contributed little, except a shy smile, and the doctor seemed more interested in his wine than in making small talk. It was midway through dessert that Marchmont suddenly said, "I received a rather peculiar letter this morning. Meant to mention it earlier, but it slipped my mind." He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and placed it on the table. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "A letter of interest, Colonel?" Marchmont chuckled. "I'll let you decide. Here, have a look." He passed the paper to Poirot, who examined it with a delicacy as if it were a Fabergé egg. The handwriting was erratic, slanted and trembling. The ink had bled slightly into the cheap paper. Poirot read aloud. "Justice delayed is not justice denied. He will die as he made her die. After 10 years, the time has come." A small silence followed. The candle flames seemed to flicker in response. Dr. Whitcomb made a gruff sound. "Nonsense! Some crank!" Helen leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Is that all it said?" "That's all," Marchmont replied. "No name, no signature, no return address, just that." I chuckled nervously. "Sounds like the beginning of a Gothic novel." Poirot, however, was not smiling. "Colonel, may I keep this letter for a time?" he asked, folding it neatly. By all means, said Marchmont. But don't tell me you take it seriously. Poirot did not answer immediately. He studied the paper once more, then placed it gently into his pocket. One must never dismiss a letter simply because it lacks a name. Sometimes it is those who remain hidden who speak the most loudly. That evening, after the others had retired, Poirot and I sat in the library, which smelled richly of pipe tobacco and old books. He had laid the mysterious letter upon the side table and was contemplating it as though it were a relic from ancient Egypt. I do not like it, Hastings, he murmured. No, not at all. Come now, Poirot, I said, settling into the leather armchair with a brandy. It's clearly some dramatic hoax. A village lunatic, perhaps. Happens more often than you'd think. Poirot shook his head. Non, mon ami. The choice of words. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is not the cry of a madman. It is the language of someone who believes they are owed a reckoning. I sipped my drink. But 10 years. What could possibly have happened here 10 years ago? Poirot turned his gaze toward the portrait above the fireplace, a painting of a striking woman in Edwardian dress, her face composed but sorrowful. Lady Evelyn Marchmont, Poirot said quietly, the Colonel's late wife, died 10 years ago in this house. I blinked. Yes, I recall something about that. A fall down the staircase, wasn't it? Oui, an accident, it was said. But one wonders, is it possible that someone did not believe it so? Someone who waited silently, biding their time? You think this letter refers to her? Poirot did not answer at once. He rose and walked slowly to the hearth, folding his hands behind his back. There are murders that shout, he said finally, and there are murders that whisper. The difference, Hastings, is only in the patience of the killer. I felt a chill, despite the fire's warmth. Outside, a clock chimed 10 times. Poirot turned from the fire and gave me that curious little smile of his. Let us see, mon ami, whether this house contains only memories, or something else entirely. I awoke the next morning to the sound of bird song and the faint chime of the breakfast bell. The atmosphere was, on the surface, unchanged. The same gentle breeze through the curtains, the scent of roses drifting from the garden below. But as I descended the staircase to join Poirot in the dining room, I could sense a shift. Something was heavier in the air. Mrs. Danvers, usually composed to the point of granite, looked faintly unsettled as she handed Poirot an envelope. This just came by post, sir. No name, just left at the front door. Poirot took it gently and, without a word, opened it with his silver fruit knife. His eyes scanned the page, and a frown settled upon his brow, lightly at first, and then with weight. He handed it to me. April 20th. The truth will find him. That was all. Nothing more. No explanation. No signature. I swallowed. That's 4 days from now. Just so, Hastings, Poirot replied, returning the note to its envelope with deliberate care. It appears our mysterious correspondent has a calendar. That is never a good sign. Do you still believe it's more than an idle threat? He gave me a look. Mon ami, this letter does not threaten. It promises. That is quite different. Colonel Marchmont arrived moments later, brushing the whole thing off with a stiff laugh. April 20th? Well, we'll see what the devil happens, won't we? But I saw it, even if the Colonel did not. The way Poirot tilted his head, ever so slightly, as if listening for something most could not hear. Later that morning, while we sat under the wisteria-covered pergola, Poirot laid both letters before him, like sacred texts. The slant of the handwriting, he murmured, is identical. The same uneven pressure, the same tremble in the T crossings. But more than that, Hastings, look at the psychology of it. I leaned in, brow furrowed. Psychology? Yes. The first letter is emotion restrained. Justice delayed is not justice denied. That is someone suppressing rage. But the second, I read it again. April 20th. The truth will find him. Poirot nodded. No longer restrained. There is certainty now. A plan in motion. A decision made. You think something will happen on that date? Poirot folded his hands. I do not think, Hastings. I know. The vengeance of 10 years has found its voice, and unless we stop it, it shall soon find its victim. It was just after luncheon, the kind of quiet hour in the country when even the birds seemed to doze in the hedgerows, that Poirot made his move. Colonel Marchmont was seated on the terrace with a cigar, the Times draped lazily over one knee. He looked every inch the man who scoffed at superstition and dark talk, but I noticed the way his fingers drummed on the armrest, rapidly, repeatedly. Colonel, Poirot said gently, taking the seat beside him, I would make a small request of you. Oh, Marchmont raised an eyebrow. You will forgive me if I speak with candour, but these letters, they are not the idle scribbles of a mischief maker. No, they speak of something deeply personal, something long buried. Marchmont shifted. A grudge, then? That's all? An old servant dismissed, perhaps? Perhaps, said Poirot, and I saw the glint in his eye, the one that usually meant he already knew more than he let on. But I must ask, will you allow me to make some inquiries? Quietly, discreetly. Among your household, Marchmont's jaw tightened. What exactly are you suggesting? Merely that someone under this very roof may know more than they admit. These letters, they are not random. They were delivered with knowledge of the past, of this house. A pause. I don't want a scandal, Marchmont said, his voice low. And I, said Poirot, placing a hand on his heart, do not want a second letter to become a eulogy. Permit me to observe, to ask questions, nothing more. At last Marchmont nodded. Very well. But no theatrics, Poirot. Poirot gave the smallest of bows. You have my word, Colonel. No theatrics, only the truth. And thus began our investigation, not with sirens or shouts, but with the softest of murmurs and the quiet unlocking of long-closed doors. The room had not been touched in 10 years. Lady Evelyn's study, locked since her death, was located at the end of a narrow corridor on the manor's west wing. The air outside it felt colder, though that may have been my imagination. Mrs. Danvers produced the key from a box in the cellar, where it had been kept in a sealed envelope labelled "Private." I thought her hand trembled slightly as she handed it to Poirot. The Colonel always said it should remain shut, she murmured. Poirot simply nodded. Nevertheless, Madame, time has a way of making its own demands. He inserted the key. The lock turned stiffly, as though reluctant to yield. Inside, the room was dark and untouched, like a scene preserved in amber. Dust coated the furniture in a fine layer, yet everything was precisely arranged. Books on the shelf, a shawl folded over the armchair, an empty teacup on a side table. The smell of lavender, faded but persistent, hung in the air. Poirot moved slowly, reverently. She was meticulous, he murmured, brushing a fingertip across the desk. The dust tells us so. See how the items are positioned, not shifted for years, not even by servants. I looked around uneasily. It feels wrong coming in here. He pointed to the bookcase. That copy of Cranford, do you see the crease in the spine? Read more than once, I would wager. Lady Evelyn did not simply decorate with books. She read them. Then he turned toward a framed photograph on the desk. A young man, James Marchmont, stood beside Evelyn, his expression caught between a smile and uncertainty. Poirot studied it for a long moment. She loved her son. That much is clear. I saw something strange then, Poirot, staring at a chessboard set up on the window ledge. The pieces were mid-game, White's turn next, but something was missing. A bishop, Poirot said softly. Black, gone. Perhaps lost. Perhaps, he said, but his eyes lingered. He reached beneath the desk and retrieved a thin notebook wedged deep inside. Most pages were blank, save for a single entry. He will never forgive me. Poirot closed the book gently. She was afraid, he said. The question is, of whom? Helen Marchmont was the sort of woman who gave the impression she was always just barely tolerating your presence. Elegant, reserved, and dressed in soft greys, she sat across from Poirot in the morning room, a cup of tea untouched before her. I assume you're here to ask about the letters, she said, without waiting for pleasantries. Indeed, madame, Poirot replied, folding his hands. And also about your late mother-in-law. Her eyes did not flicker. Lady Evelyn has been dead for 10 years. Surely that chapter is closed. Perhaps. But sometimes the book is merely set aside, not finished. She tilted her head. A poetic way of putting it. Poetry has its uses, Poirot said smoothly. You lived here with her for some years. Yes, until her death. And how was the relationship? Helen's lips thinned. Cordial. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Only cordial. She disapproved of me, Helen said bluntly. She believed I married James for position, not love. And did you? Helen met his gaze without flinching. I married him because I pitied him. That may not be love in the romantic sense, but it is something. Poirot said nothing, only observed. I, on the other hand, nearly dropped my teacup. You disliked her, Poirot said at last. Yes, Helen said, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. She was controlling, manipulative, and subtle about it. She never raised her voice, never said anything directly cruel, but she could destroy a person with a single glance. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And yet you remained under her roof. I had nowhere else to go. He nodded slowly. A difficult woman to live with, I imagine. She ruled the house with silk gloves, Helen said. But make no mistake, there was iron beneath them. As Poirot rose to leave, he said softly, It is often the polite tyrants, madam, who leave behind the deepest wounds. James Marchmont was a man whose entire presence suggested apology. Apology for being too tall, too quiet, too nervy, too himself. He was slender, with a drawn face, and eyes that seemed perpetually a step away from tears or fright. I found him in the conservatory, hands trembling slightly as he misted the ferns. I'm not sure I can be of much help, Mr. Poirot, he said with a faint, faltering smile. My memory isn't what it used to be. Poirot tilted his head. Then perhaps we shall speak not to the memory, monsieur, but to the feeling. Sometimes it is the emotion that reveals the truth. James gave a soft, joyless laugh. There was nothing but confusion then. Confusion and guilt. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Guilt, Monsieur Marchmont? James hesitated, then looked down at the watering can in his hand. My mother, we weren't speaking the week she died. There was a row. A silly thing, really. I stayed away that night. Went to the village. When I came back, she was already, gone. I noticed Poirot watching James carefully, not just the words, but the way they were said, the downward cast of the eyes, the shift in posture. And you blame yourself? I always have, James whispered. If I had been there, perhaps I could have stopped it. Poirot nodded slowly. You were what? 21 at the time? Yes. A difficult age to forgive oneself, Poirot said gently, especially for things one did not do. James blinked, startled. You think I didn't? But Poirot merely adjusted his cuffs and murmured, We shall see what the truth tells us, monsieur. It has a way of surfacing, whether invited or not. Dr. Whitcomb greeted us in his surgery with a brisk handshake and the slightly musty scent of tweed. A man in his early 60s, with a clean-shaven face and clipped vowels, he exuded confidence. Yet there was something about the way his hand trembled as he poured tea that made me glance at Poirot. "Lady Evelyn's death," Poirot began. "You were the one who signed the certificate, yes?" "Indeed," the doctor replied. "It was an accident, a fall down the staircase. I arrived shortly after." Poirot's tone remained neutral. "Forgive me, doctor, but I must ask, did you perform a thorough examination?" Whitcomb stiffened. "There was no need. Her neck was broken. Instantaneous, I assure you." "But the bruising?" Poirot asked gently. "The coroner's report at the time mentioned some marks inconsistent with a simple fall." The doctor hesitated. "There was some speculation, but the colonel insisted it be handled quietly. She was a respected lady. No need for scandal. Even if it meant overlooking other possibilities." The doctor took a long sip of his tea. "Look, Monsieur Poirot, it was 10 years ago. There was no autopsy. Perhaps that was a mistake, but I followed the family's wishes. I kept the peace." "Peace?" Poirot echoed. "Or silence?" Whitcomb flushed. "I was doing what I thought best." Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet, when one silences the truth, doctor, it tends to find its own voice, sooner or later." The doctor turned away, busying himself with the tea tray. "If there's nothing else—" "There is always something else," Poirot said quietly. As we left, he added under his breath, "A man with too much to lose often forgets the details that matter most." Miss Lane had once been the governess, and now returned as companion to Helen Marchmont. She was small, tightly wound, with steel-rimmed glasses and a voice like distant chimes. She met us in the garden, hands folded primly, her gaze somewhere between defiance and regret. "I always liked Lady Evelyn," she said, seemingly unprompted. "She was very particular, but kind in her way." Poirot inclined his head. "You left the household just before her death, I believe." "I was dismissed," she corrected. "Lady Evelyn had her reasons, I'm sure." "Did you ever discover those reasons?" Miss Lane paused. "I saw something. Something I was not supposed to see." Poirot leaned forward. "May I ask, what was it?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It was late. I was returning from the village. I passed by the study window and saw the colonel. He was shouting. Lady Evelyn stood quite still. She looked pale. I've never seen her look frightened before." Poirot's eyes sparkled. "Frightened? That is a strong word." "She was a strong woman," Miss Lane replied. "It takes much to unnerve someone like her." "And what happened next?" Miss Lane shook her head. "I don't know. I didn't stay. But the next morning, I received notice. Just like that." Poirot folded his hands. "And you never told anyone?" Who would have listened? The Marchmonts were a powerful family, and I was only the help. Poirot's voice was low. "But now you have spoken, mademoiselle, and that may make all the difference." Mr. Endicott, the family solicitor, arrived late that afternoon, called in by the colonel himself after Poirot had expressed a desire to review the terms of Lady Evelyn's will. The man was slick, immaculately dressed, with a moustache as crisp as his vowels, and a perpetual expression of polite condescension. He greeted Poirot and me with the kind of smile usually reserved for an irritating client one couldn't afford to lose. "I must say," he began, settling into the library armchair, "I wasn't expecting to be dragged back into affairs closed a decade ago." Poirot, perched neatly on the edge of a leather chair, steepled his fingers. "Yet, Monsieur Endicott, you will agree that the affairs of the dead often have the most persistent echoes. Endicott chuckled dryly. "If it's the will you're after, I can assure you it was simple and above board. Lady Evelyn left the majority of her estate to Colonel Marchmont, with a small trust for James, until he turned 30. And he is how old now?" Poirot asked. 31. "Ah," Poirot said softly. "So the trust has already been released?" "Yes, last year." Poirot's eyes sparkled. "And yet, it seems not all was so simple. I note there was an amendment made only a few weeks before her death." Endicott's smile faltered. "Yes." She adjusted the language slightly to allow for earlier access, on condition of the Colonel's approval. "And did he grant it?" Endicott cleared his throat. He preferred to wait. "A curious decision," Poirot murmured, "to override the wishes of a dying wife." "I wouldn't call it that," Endicott said stiffly. "It was all legal, nothing untoward." Poirot gave a mild nod. "And yet, monsieur, legality is not always morality." As we left the room, Poirot turned to me and said quietly, "There is a discomfort in him, Hastings. It may not be guilt, but it is something close, and discomfort, mon ami, often tells a greater truth than denial." April 20th arrived with sunshine. The house was unusually silent that morning. Breakfast passed in strained civility. Colonel Marchmont, in particular, appeared distracted. He excused himself early, claiming correspondence awaited him in the study. It was just past 11 when a scream rang out, shrill and panicked. Mrs. Danvers had gone to the west wing to dust and found the study door locked. No answer, no sound from within. We arrived seconds later. The door was forced. Colonel Marchmont lay slumped in the very chair where Lady Evelyn's photograph still rested. A glass sat on the table, the remnants of brandy at the bottom. His eyes were wide open, unseeing. A faint scent lingered in the air. Bitter almonds. Poirot leaned in, his face solemn. "It is poison," he said quietly. "Administered not in haste, but in planning." And then he noticed the chessboard. The pieces were all in place, except for one. "The Black Bishop," Poirot whispered. "It is gone." He rose, his voice grave. "This," he said, "was not an act of impulse. It was an act of memory." It was the day after Colonel Marchmont's death, and the house was cloaked in a silence far deeper than mere mourning. The west wing was sealed, the study off-limits under the local constable's instruction, and the staff moved with an unnatural hush, as though afraid to disturb something still lurking. Poirot, however, was more alert than ever. There was a peculiar sharpness to his movements that morning, less his usual fussiness, more a calculated efficiency. I found him in the library, seated with several newspaper clippings spread before him, a small notebook open at his elbow. "Good morning, Hastings," he said, without looking up. "Did you sleep well?" "Hardly," I muttered. "Someone was murdered under this roof, Poirot." He nodded slowly. "Oui, and yet perhaps not for the first time." That remark gave me pause. "You mean Lady Evelyn?" Poirot gestured to the clippings. 10 years ago her death was ruled accidental, but the whispers, Hastings, they never ceased. Look at this article from the Derbyshire Gazette, dated 2 months after her death. "Society matron's tragic fall, hushed scandal at Marchmont Manor." He tapped the headline with a slim finger. "Scandal," I echoed. Poirot leaned back. "There were rumours. A younger man, an artist, invited to the house to paint her portrait. Lady Evelyn was seen walking with him in the gardens." He left abruptly before the commission was complete. No explanation. "And you think she was involved romantically?" "Perhaps. Perhaps only platonically. But to a husband with pride and power, Hastings, even a whisper of such impropriety might have been intolerable." I considered this uncomfortably. But that doesn't prove she didn't fall down the stairs. No, but it casts new light on the shadows surrounding her demise. Poirot stood, smoothing his waistcoat. I shall speak to Helen again. There is something brittle in her composure. She knows more than she has said. Do you think she knew about this alleged affair? I think, Poirot said, picking up his hat, that she hated Lady Evelyn not for what she did, but for what she threatened to do to the house's illusion of order. Helen Marchmont met us in the morning room, her face pale but as poised as ever. A silver tea service lay untouched between us as Poirot began in his usual courteous manner. Madame, he said gently, may I trouble you once more with questions regarding the past? If it will put an end to this madness, she replied, voice tight. You have already told me you and Lady Evelyn did not see eye to eye. But now we hear whispers of a man, a painter. She stiffened. Yes, Philippe Desroches. He was hired to paint her portrait the summer before she died. Did you know him? I met him, of course. He was charming. The sort of man who calls every woman ma chère and means absolutely none of it. And Lady Evelyn? Helen hesitated. She entertained his attentions. She was lonely, I think. Her marriage to the Colonel had long since become one of appearances. But even so, I don't believe anything happened. But appearances matter, Poirot said quietly. Helen looked away. Yes, especially to men like my father-in-law. Poirot leaned forward. Tell me, madame, on the night of Lady Evelyn's death, where were you? In my room. I had a headache. Did anyone see you? Number Y didn't leave until morning. But I assure you, I had nothing to do with her death. You were dismissed from the will, Poirot said softly. Helen's eyes flashed. Yes. She made a point of cutting me out, just weeks before she died. Said I wasn't a suitable influence on James. I imagine she thought I was ambitious. Were you? I wanted comfort, that's all. Not money. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, the people who crave comfort most are often the ones who have never truly known it. Helen said nothing, but her hands trembled as she poured the tea. Poirot rose gently. Merci, madame. That is all. For now. Outside, I turned to him. Do you believe her? Poirot didn't answer immediately. Then he said, a woman who lies with such ease, Hastings, often tells the truth by accident. We found Dr. Whitcomb in his surgery, once again fussing with papers and appearing every inch the distracted country physician. But something in his manner had shifted since Colonel Marchmont's death. There was a tightness around the eyes, a hesitation in his speech, subtle signs that, as Poirot would say, le ver dans la pomme, the worm in the apple, had begun to show. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings. He gestured toward the chairs opposite his desk, but remained standing. I trust you're not here for medical reasons. Non, Poirot said with a soft smile. Unless you count a persistent curiosity as a malady. Whitcomb gave a half laugh, but it rang hollow. Poirot wasted no time. Doctor, you were the first on the scene the night Lady Evelyn died. Yes, I arrived within the hour. She was already gone. You signed the certificate of death. Cause, broken neck, fall from the stairs. That's correct. But the bruising on the wrists and shoulders was never mentioned in the official record. Whitcomb's jaw twitched. There were inconsistencies, but the Colonel insisted he didn't want scandal. He said she had fainted. That was all. And you agreed. The doctor didn't answer. He moved to the window, staring out at the grey April sky. I had my career to consider, he said finally, my position in the village, my patients, and Archibald was a powerful man. Poirot rose and moved beside him, not unkindly. And now he is dead, perhaps poisoned. Are you still protecting him, Doctor? I don't know what I'm protecting anymore, Whitcomb muttered. I sometimes wonder if I ever did. Poirot placed a hand lightly on the man's shoulder. The truth, Doctor, is not a burden to those who tell it, only to those who conceal it. There was a long pause. Then quietly, the doctor said, He asked me to leave certain things out of the report. Bruises, a strange cut on her hand, and the fact that her shoes had no scuff marks, suggesting she hadn't fallen. She'd been placed. I glanced at Poirot in astonishment. Then she was murdered. Possibly, said Whitcomb, but there was no proof, only fear. Poirot nodded gravely. And fear, Doctor, is often the midwife of silence. The greenhouse stood some way beyond the orchard, an old glass-panelled structure filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. We found James Marchmont inside, pruning a cluster of delicate white lilies, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with soil. He looked up as we approached, a flicker of guilt, or perhaps simply worry, passing over his features. Still at it, I see, I said, trying for casual cheer. It helps to stay busy, James replied softly. The house feels heavier now. Poirot examined a nearby pot of begonias with deliberate interest before speaking. Monsieur Marchmont, I must ask, where were you yesterday morning at precisely 11 o'clock? James hesitated. Here, in the greenhouse. I came out after breakfast and stayed until I was called in. Alone? He nodded. Yes. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And no one saw you? Not a single soul? I don't think so. Helen was on the telephone. The staff were busy. I suppose not. Poirot picked up a fallen leaf from the floor and inspected it. You garden often? Most days, James said, brow furrowed. Why? You are meticulous. The orchids are thriving. But look here. This glove. Poirot held up a single leather glove, half buried beneath a table. Yours? James looked startled. I thought I'd lost that. Poirot murmured. Curious that it was not where you left it. James blinked. What are you implying? Poirot didn't answer directly. He merely turned and surveyed the glass walls around them. A greenhouse is a place of nurture, of concealment. Things grow here, yes, but so do secrets. James flinched. After we'd left, I couldn't help asking, do you really think he was out here the whole time? Poirot tapped his temple. It is not about where he was, Hastings, but why he was alone. An alibi uncorroborated is no alibi at all. Then you suspect him? I suspect everyone, mon ami, Poirot said, eyes gleaming. Until the facts tell me otherwise. Miss Lane was a curious blend of steel and sentiment, always with her back straight and her chin just a little too high, as if daring the world to underestimate her. When Poirot requested to speak with her again regarding the morning of Colonel Marchmont's death, she received us in the small sitting room reserved for companions and governesses, her knitting needles clacking softly in the background. I understand, she said before Poirot could even ask a question, that you are concerned about my whereabouts on the morning the Colonel passed. You anticipate me, mademoiselle, Poirot said with a bow. And anticipation is often the cousin of concealment, she sniffed. I conceal nothing. In fact, I have proof I was outside that morning. From her handbag, she produced a glossy photograph. It showed the garden from a low angle, spring daffodils in bloom, the manor visible in the background. And there, on the path near the rose arbour, stood Miss Lane, stiff as a soldier, mid-stride. I set the timer on my camera, she said crisply. I've taken up photography as a hobby. The machine was on a tripod in the hedge. Poirot took the photo delicately, examining it with narrowed eyes. Très intéressant. But when precisely was this taken? Just after 10, perhaps 10:15. I had just returned from the village. Do you have a watch in the photograph? Number. But the light. Look at the shadows. Poirot smiled gently. Shadows, alas, are very accommodating to deception. Her eyes narrowed. Are you calling me a liar? I never call anyone a liar, mademoiselle, he said. I simply listen for the harmony, or discord, between the truth and its performance. When we left, I asked Poirot, do you think she doctored the photo? He shook his head. Non, Hastings. I think it is genuine. But genuine does not mean innocent. She wanted to be seen at that time. That is always cause for suspicion. If Mr. Endicott had been uneasy before, he was practically unravelling by the time we returned to him for questioning. He was seated in the study now, a pile of documents before him that he barely pretended to read. I already told you, he snapped. I was in London. Left the evening before, stayed the night, and returned after the Colonel's death. I have appointments to prove it. Poirot, unbothered, took a seat beside him. Yes, you mentioned that. And yet, I received word from the railway station. Endicott stiffened. The porter, Monsieur Jarvis, a good memory, that one, says he saw you disembark from the 10:12 train to the village on the night before the Colonel died. That's absurd. He remembers your briefcase, Poirot continued, dark brown with a brass clasp, and your cane, monogrammed. You tipped him handsomely. Unusual behaviour for someone supposedly departing, no? Endicott's face turned a shade paler. I came back for something. Papers. I wasn't here long. Poirot inclined his head. And did you see the Colonel during your brief visit? No. You're quite certain? Yes. Then perhaps he saw you. Silence. I had no reason to harm the man, Endicott said, voice strained. He was difficult, yes, but generous. We had disagreements, certainly, especially over Evelyn's will, but that was years ago. Poirot's brow lifted. Ah, so we return to that subject again. So many things, it seems, lead us back to Lady Evelyn. Endicott rose abruptly. I've told you all I know. Poirot stood as well. Then I must bid you adieu, Monsieur Endicott. But remember this, secrets are like debts. They must be paid eventually, and always with interest. As we stepped into the hallway, I whispered, He's hiding something, isn't he? Poirot gave a small nod. The question, Hastings, is not whether he is lying. It is who he is lying for. The portrait of Lady Evelyn hung in the drawing room, a dignified oil rendering of a woman poised but distant, one hand resting on a side table, the other holding a closed fan. It was, like the house itself, beautiful and unsettling. Poirot stood before it that afternoon, alone but for me, hands clasped behind his back. She was a proud woman, he murmured, but not cold. There is pain in that expression, Hastings. Look, do you see how the eyes seem not to meet ours, but to gaze just past, into something remembered? I frowned. It's just paint. Ah, but it is not. It is intention rendered in pigment. The artist captured more than features. He captured fear. Poirot stepped forward and gently ran a hand along the bottom of the frame. Then, with a deft motion, he pressed a finger into the wooden panel beneath. A faint click, and a narrow drawer slid open. Good heavens, I said. Inside, yellowed paper, sealed with wax long cracked. Poirot unfolded it with reverence. It was a letter. To be opened only in the event of my death under suspicious circumstances. To be given to my son, if he is ever ready to know the truth. Poirot scanned the lines silently, then handed it to me. He knows. I saw it in his face. And now I fear he will not forgive. If anything happens to me, it is because of what I told him, or what I refused to. The signature read simply, Evelyn, I stared. She feared someone close to her. Poirot nodded. And note, he will not forgive. Not he will act, or he will harm me. The language is careful, emotional, defensive. Who do you think she meant? Poirot replaced the letter in the drawer. We shall find out. But mon ami, this I will say, the truth is no longer sleeping. It has been whispering for years. Now finally, it begins to speak. It was just after tea when Poirot summoned every inhabitant of Marchmont Manor to the drawing room. The atmosphere was charged with the peculiar tension that only Hercule Poirot could summon, somewhere between a curtain about to rise and an execution awaiting its signal. The storm outside had begun to roll in, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. A fire crackled softly, and the ticking of the ornate mantel clock felt, to my ears, like the beating heart of some hidden truth growing ever louder. Poirot stood at the far end of the room, near the fireplace, and there, placed with ceremonial precision, stood the missing black bishop from the study chessboard. It sat alone on the mantel, a sentinel to what was to come. "My friends," Poirot began solemnly, "I thank you for gathering. The events that have unfolded in this house are not accidents of time nor whims of fate. They are, as always, the product of human nature, of envy, silence, guilt, and hatred." No one moved. Helen sat stiffly, arms folded. James stood behind a chair, white-knuckled. Dr. Whitcomb looked down at his hands. Miss Lane, rigid, her face unreadable. Mr. Endicott lingered near the doorway, as if planning retreat. Poirot continued, voice calm but commanding. "You each have played a role in a drama that began 10 years ago, and now the final act has come." He turned to the bishop and tapped it gently with a gloved fingertip. "This piece," he said softly, "was removed not in haste, but in memory. A symbol, yes, but also a signature. The game was paused that night, and now, at last, it has resumed." I confess I felt a chill as he looked around the room. "Let us begin," he said, "with what was thought to be a simple matter of grief, but was, in truth, a murder disguised." Poirot turned first to Helen Marchmont, whose posture had not shifted a single inch since we entered. Her face was frozen in a mask of aristocratic distaste. "Madame Marchmont," Poirot said gently, "you have been frank, refreshingly so, about your dislike of Lady Evelyn." "I saw no point in denying it," she replied flatly. "She and I were never friends." "Non, but dislike alone does not make a murderer." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you clearing me, Monsieur Poirot?" He smiled faintly. "Not quite yet." He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "You had motive. Evelyn's removal from your life would have given you greater influence over James, perhaps even over the household. You had at the time no affection for her. But what you lacked, madame, was opportunity. I lived under the same roof." "Yes," Poirot nodded, "but not in the same mind. You were watched closely. Your movements were recorded by the staff. You had no private access to Evelyn's study, not then, nor more recently, to the locked room in which Colonel Marchmont died." Helen's eyes narrowed. "Then who are you accusing?" "I accuse no one, yet. I merely eliminate. You were, how shall we say, an unpleasant distraction, but not the author of murder." A flicker of something, relief, perhaps even disappointment, crossed her features. "However," Poirot continued, "your contempt, though not lethal, was useful." "To whom?" Poirot turned sharply. "To someone who needed it. To someone who wanted the suspicion spread like ash across every corner of this household." He walked to the fireplace and placed his hand on the bishop. "You hated Lady Evelyn, yes, but hatred, madame, is a cold flame. It burns in silence. The one who struck did not strike from hate. They struck from fear. Helen said nothing. Her hands, folded tightly in her lap, relaxed for the first time. Poirot turned to the others. One name is removed from the list. Let us proceed to the next. Poirot turned now to Miss Lane, who sat with her hands folded tightly over her handbag, like a schoolmistress waiting for judgment. Her expression was unreadable, though her eyes darted once, just once, toward the bishop on the mantel. "Mademoiselle Lane," Poirot said with an almost grandfatherly kindness, "you were dismissed shortly before Lady Evelyn's death." "That's no secret," she replied. "I was told I was no longer needed." "Indeed, but we now know it was not incompetence or redundancy. It was fear." Miss Lane stiffened. "Whose fear?" Poirot moved toward her, his voice soft. "Lady Evelyn's." She blinked. "I don't—" He raised a hand. "Permit me to explain." Poirot turned to address the room. 10 years ago, the governess walked past the study window one evening and saw something. A quarrel, a violent one. Miss Lane opened her mouth, then closed it. You saw Colonel Marchmont shout. You saw Lady Evelyn recoil. You saw his hand raise, perhaps not strike, but threaten. She looked down at her bag, fingers white on the handle. "She dismissed you the next morning," Poirot continued. "Not out of anger, but to protect you, to remove the one witness who might be in danger." A stunned silence settled over the room. Miss Lane whispered, "She said it was better I leave. That I didn't belong in this household any more. I thought she meant—" "She meant," Poirot said gently, "that she had already lost control of it." Tears formed in Miss Lane's eyes, though she blinked them away. "I never told anyone. I didn't think it mattered. By the time I found out she died, it was too late." Poirot gave her a long, measured look. "And now, at last, you have told someone. And that matters greatly." He turned back to the room. "The past is not a ghost. It lives in our silences. And sometimes, in the silence of a governess, the truth waits 10 years to be heard." Poirot turned next to Dr. Whitcomb, who sat hunched on the edge of his chair, his fingertips pressed together, eyes fixed on the carpet. Of all the faces in the room, his was the one most used to hiding expression. Yet I saw it then, a flicker of something unmistakable. Shame. "Dr. Whitcomb," Poirot said gently, "you are a man of science, a man of reason, and yet you made a most unscientific decision 10 years ago." The doctor looked up. "I did what I had to." "No, doctor," Poirot said with quiet firmness. "You did what you were told to do." Poirot stepped forward and placed the death certificate on the side table. Lady Evelyn Marchmont. Cause of death, accidental fall. And yet you knew. There were bruises on the arms, a cut on her palm, and no scuffing on her shoes to indicate a stumble. The doctor closed his eyes. She was already gone. An autopsy would have changed nothing. "It would have changed everything," Poirot replied. "It would have told the truth." Whitcomb's voice was low, defensive. Colonel Marchmont insisted it be handled quietly. He said Evelyn had fainted. He said the family couldn't survive the scandal, that it would ruin James. And there was pressure. Poirot folded his hands. "Ah, la pression sociale. A powerful force in such households. And what of your conscience, doctor? Did it sleep peacefully these 10 years? The doctor did not answer. Poirot's voice softened. "You were not the murderer, but you were the one who drew the curtain over the stage. You allowed the act to end before the audience could see the truth." Whitcomb looked up, eyes weary. "And now?" "Now," Poirot said, "you are freed from silence, if not from guilt." There was something almost merciful in Poirot's tone, and though the doctor said nothing, I saw his shoulders ease ever so slightly, as if a burden had finally shifted. Poirot turned last to the man standing stiffly near the door, Mr. Endicott, the solicitor. The expression on his face was that of a man who knew the trap had already closed, yet was still hoping for a last-minute reprieve. Monsieur Endicott, Poirot began, you have been, throughout this affair, the most careful, always precise, always composed, but too composed, perhaps. I'm not sure what you mean, Endicott said stiffly. Poirot held up a copy of the will. You claimed that Lady Evelyn left the majority of her estate to the Colonel, with a trust for James. You said it was straightforward. Yes, that's correct. But what you failed to mention, Poirot said, turning a page, is the codicil, the handwritten amendment she made just days before her death, authorizing early access to James's inheritance without requiring his father's permission. Endicott's jaw clenched. It wasn't legally binding. It was witnessed, and Lady Evelyn intended it to be added to the will. Poirot stepped closer, and you chose to ignore it. She was under emotional stress, Endicott said quickly. It was the night after a terrible quarrel. She wasn't thinking clearly. Poirot raised a finger. Ah, but you were. And you realized what that codicil implied. That she no longer trusted her husband. That she feared what might come. Endicott said nothing. You made a choice, monsieur, Poirot said quietly. Not out of greed, but loyalty. You wished to protect the Colonel, to protect the family's name. And so, you buried the truth. I believed I was doing the right thing, Endicott muttered. Poirot gave a small, solemn nod. Many crimes are committed in the name of righteousness, but make no mistake, monsieur, altering a legal document is no small matter. Endicott's eyes dropped to the floor. You did not poison Colonel Marchmont, Poirot added, but you helped lay the foundation for silence to flourish. And when truth is smothered, mon ami, it does not die, it festers. The room was silent. Poirot turned once more to the chess piece on the mantel. And now, he said, there remains only one move to make. For a moment, Poirot said nothing. He stood before the assembled group, his gaze moving slowly across each face, pausing not with accusation, but with something deeper, pity. Then he turned to James Marchmont. The young man had remained eerily quiet throughout Poirot's deductions. His hands trembled faintly at his sides, his gaze locked somewhere between the fireplace and the floor, as if staring into a void only he could see. James, Poirot said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, you have carried a burden too long, a burden not only of grief, but of silence. And in that silence, something festered. A promise was made, yes, a vow to someone who could no longer speak for herself. James looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. I loved her, he said hoarsely. She was the only one who saw me. Poirot gave a solemn nod. Oui, mon cher. Your mother adored you, and you, quiet, observant, wounded, you saw more than you let on. A murmur went through the room. I was at the top of the stairs, James continued, voice barely above a whisper. They didn't know I was there. I heard them arguing. Then, the thud. Poirot stepped closer. And you saw your father standing over her. James nodded. He didn't cry out, didn't call for help. He just stood there, then walked away, like it was finished. And yet, Poirot said, you said nothing. I was terrified, James admitted. He was a powerful man, and I was just a boy with a weak constitution and no voice. But I never forgot. I couldn't. Poirot walked back toward the bishop on the mantel. You wrote the letters. Yes. You killed him. James closed his eyes. Yes. The room was silent. Poirot spoke with deliberate calm. You became both mourner and executioner. In your letters, you were the voice of justice. But in your hands, you carried the tools of death. James looked at him. I didn't mean to become him, but I did. Poirot sighed. It is the tragedy of revenge, mon ami. It begins with love and ends in imitation. I don't think I'll ever forget the stillness in that room, the kind of silence that comes not after a shout, but after truth. Poirot stood at the mantel once more, regarding the Black Bishop as if it were the final witness to a long-closed case. This, he began, gesturing to the piece, is not merely a trinket displaced. No, no, mes amis. It is the symbol of everything that has passed. He turned to face us all. In chess, the bishop moves diagonally, never straight, never back. A quiet piece, not as powerful as the queen or as central as the king. But it is the piece that sees the board differently. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. James chose this piece not at random. He was playing a game not of power, but of strategy, of symbol. You see, the night Lady Evelyn died, the chessboard had been left mid-game. Her final move was to advance the Black Bishop. James spoke, barely audible. It was her favourite piece. She always said it reminded her of herself. Limited, overlooked, but dangerous if cornered. Poirot nodded. When she died, the game froze. But not in your mind, mon petit. For you, it remained open, waiting. So you removed the bishop, not because it mattered to anyone else, but because it was her last act, her piece, the silent witness. Poirot's tone shifted, growing more intense. Your psyche split, did it not? One half, the dutiful son, weak, quiet, unassuming. The other, a shadow, a voice whispering of justice, of vengeance, of redress. You wrote letters in one hand, planned in the other. You placed the bishop on the mantle as a final act, declaring at last, checkmate. James did not deny it. You poisoned the drink, Poirot continued. You chose the study for poetic symmetry. You even arranged the scene around the very objects that haunted you. A portrait, a chessboard, a sealed door. You turned memory into theatre. Poirot placed the bishop back into its square on the board. The game, he said softly, is over. James exhaled a long breath, like someone finally waking from a decade-long dream. He said nothing more. He did not resist when the constable stepped forward. And Poirot, brushing a speck of dust from his cuff, murmured, "The most dangerous pieces, Hastings, are not those that shout their power, but those that move quietly and wait." It was just before dawn when the constable caught up with James. He hadn't run far, barely across the north field, through a copse of trees that led toward the old footpath to the village. His coat was flapping behind him in the wind, one shoe lost in the mud. Not exactly a fugitive, more like a ghost retracing the final steps of a dream. Poirot and I arrived moments later, summoned by the officer's whistle. James stood still, the rising sun casting long shadows across his face. There was no resistance, no pleas, no cries for mercy, just a strange, weary stillness, like a man who had finally set down a weight he had been carrying for far too long. "I wasn't trying to get away," James murmured, barely turning his head. "I only needed to walk." Poirot stepped forward. "Monsieur, you have walked in silence for 10 years, but now perhaps it is time to speak." James nodded. "They never believed me," he said softly. "Not about anything. Not my health, not my feelings, not her. So I stopped speaking. But the memory never stopped. It just kept growing, sharpening." "And the letters?" I asked. He gave a faint smile. "I wrote the first one a year after she died. Burned it. Wrote another 2 years later. Then another. And then I kept them. Dozens. Pages of things I'd never said. Last month I finally posted one." Poirot's tone was almost fatherly. "It was not justice, James, but it was pain. And pain, when silenced, becomes dangerous. James looked at him then, truly looked, as if seeing something he hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. Understanding. I didn't hate him at first, he said. I hated myself, for being weak, for staying quiet. But eventually, that hatred found somewhere else to go. He turned to the constable and held out his hands without prompting. No more running, he said. As they led him away, the birds had begun to stir in the hedgerows. Life, indifferent to drama, resumed its course. But for us, for Poirot and me, the air seemed thicker somehow, heavier. A tragedy, Poirot, I said. Do you think he'll hang? Poirot's brow furrowed. The law, it does not always distinguish the murderer from the martyr, Hastings. It only sees the act. But I see the cause. We returned to the drawing room, now empty and cold. The chessboard still sat in the corner, untouched since the night before. The bishop remained in its rightful place, restored but haunted. Poirot stood before it, lost in thought. He was not mad, he said finally. At least, not in the way the courts define madness. No? I asked. He seemed not quite whole. Poirot tapped the table gently. Not mad, divided. He turned to me. The human mind, mon ami, is capable of remarkable contortions. James Marchmont lived for 10 years with the image of his mother's fall etched into his soul. And in that decade of silence, he created a new voice. A voice that did what he could not. That planned. That waited. That punished. He picked up the bishop once more and studied it. It is always the quiet ones, Hastings. The ones who watch, who say nothing. They are the most dangerous, because they live so fully inside their minds. I shivered. He loved her, didn't he? I said. Entirely, Poirot replied. But guilt is a poor bedfellow to love. He felt he failed her, and from that failure was born a need, not only to avenge, but to balance the scales. He stepped toward the portrait of Lady Evelyn. She became a martyr in his imagination, frozen forever in his memory, and so he made himself her priest, her judge, her executioner. And the letters? Poirot's eyes gleamed. A cry for help, disguised as a warning. I sat down beside him, the weight of the case settling in. And the law will judge him, I muttered. Yes, Poirot said. But justice, mon ami, has already been served, by a hand both trembling and precise. He looked one last time at the chessboard. In the end, James was not playing against his father. He was playing against the part of himself that could not forgive. 2 days later, as the grey skies above Marchmont Manor cleared at last, the post arrived. Among the stack of correspondence, bills, a gardening catalogue, and a circular from a bootmaker in Derby, was a single envelope addressed in a hand that stopped Poirot mid-step. He turned it over slowly, examined the wax seal, and gave a soft, nearly imperceptible sigh. From him, I asked. He nodded. We, posted the morning of the murder. Before the act, we opened it in the study. Inside was a single sheet of thick ivory paper. The handwriting immediately struck me as odd, slanted, uneven, not the same as the carefully printed threats. Poirot read it aloud. Monsieur Poirot, if this reaches you, it means I have gone too far. I do not know what I will do, only that I have come to the end of my strength. I cannot sleep. I cannot forgive. But I no longer trust myself. The lines between justice and revenge blur more each day. I remember her laugh, the way she hummed in the garden, and now all I hear is the sound of her fall. Forgive me. I never meant to become him. J. Poirot folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. It is written with the left hand, he said quietly. I frowned. Why? To distance himself, Poirot replied. To create separation, to speak as one half of a divided soul. He placed the letter gently on the table. "He asked for forgiveness," I said softly. Poirot looked out the window, and he meant it. That evening, Poirot and I stood on the manor's front terrace, the scent of wet grass and fading lilacs heavy in the air. The constables had gone. The family had scattered. Only silence remained, thicker now, almost reverent. I lit a pipe and glanced over at Poirot. "You've solved murders in train compartments, opera boxes, moorland inns. But this felt different." Poirot did not answer at once. His eyes remained fixed on the distant hills, their outlines soft in the mist. "We, Hastings," he said finally, "because this was not a murder of passion or greed. It was a murder born from the deepest of wounds, an open heart sealed shut by silence." He turned to me, face solemn. "You see, mon ami, we concern ourselves so often with locked rooms. But the most dangerous locks are not made of wood and iron. They are the ones placed upon the heart. They trap pain and regret and memory. And one day, when there is no more space inside, something must break." I was quiet for a long time. "And the bishop?" I asked. Poirot gave a faint smile. "A piece moved once, and then hidden for 10 years. A move forgotten by all but one." He tapped his temple lightly. "It was never about the game, Hastings. It was about what remained unplayed." The last breeze stirred the chessboard in the study. Poirot looked out once more. "The greatest mysteries," he said quietly, "are not found in locked rooms, but in locked hearts." And so, the truth, hidden for a decade behind silence and sorrow, came to light not through force, but through the little grey cells. For Hercule Poirot, the crime was never about poison or letters or chess pieces. It was about emotion suppressed, justice distorted, and a mind divided between guilt and grief. "You see, mon ami," Poirot said, adjusting his cuffs as the wind stirred the final pages of the case. "It is not always the obvious clue that solves the mystery, but the human heart, so often underestimated, that reveals the truth in the end." I glanced at the bishop on the mantel, then back to Poirot. "Well," I said, "at least next time we sit down for a game of chess, I'll think twice before I take the bishop." What do you think was the real moment when Poirot knew James was the murderer? Was it the missing bishop? Or something deeper? Tell us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this classic Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring even more of Agatha Christie's thrilling stories and Poirot's brilliance to life every week. And remember, more cunning crimes and clever deductions are just around the corner.